Hi, and welcome to your professional development series titled One Size Does Not Fit All, Understanding and Applying Culturally Responsive Considerations for Families. I'm Dr. Tracy Gershwin, and I'm a professor of special education and a board certified behavior analyst, and I'm excited to present this topic to you. The objectives for our session are to first understand the experiences of families who are culturally and linguistically diverse and have children with disabilities who are served in U.S. schools. Then I'm going to present frameworks for partnering with CLD families, including the interrelated notions of intersectionality and discrit, and the application of equitable collaboration. And then finally, I'm going to describe culturally responsive strategies aimed to actively include families and students. So before we get started, there's some important cautionary things I always like to share with groups. First, let's always remember that the student should always be considered as the first and most important member of the IEP team. And so while I will speak mostly about families and professionals today, we're always here thinking about the student. That's why we're working together. And then I'll also be using the words families and parents and teacher and educator and professional interchangeably, so that I will be speaking to the variety of audiences that I know exist in our schools and our communities. And then finally, as we work to understand how to meet the needs of culturally, linguistically, and diverse families, it's important that we have a general understanding of our definition. So these families are defined as families in the US whose primary language is not English or who are not European American. So as we get started here, there's some information I want to present about existing family research in special education. First and foremost, we know that most published studies examine parents who represent dominant groups. So those are generally white and middle class families with a disproportionate representation of participants, meaning many of our participants in family research are mothers. We also know that parent behaviors are often defined, expected, and studied in relation to school-based structures and expectations without explicit recognition of the dynamics of race, class, culture, power, and privilege. And finally, some interventions that may be designed to address family participation might actually instead serve to further alienate culturally, linguistically, and diverse families. This is concerning given that the majority of our families that are served in schools today are culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse. So what this tells us is that we have a need for more depth and consideration of working with families. So while I present to you information that we have gleaned from the research thus far, the previous slide is indicative of the need to go further. We need to know more from other families who represent different demographics, needs, etc. We know that the definition of family looks different across all different generations and regions. So we have a need for more depth and consideration of families because current research uses oversimplified notions of culture and diversity, including an over-reliance on broad demographic categories. So we know that the construct of diversity has often focused solely on diverse abilities rather than the broader array of multiple social identities that we see used in other fields. And when we use within group differences are ignored, the risk of stereotyping, marginalization, misrepresentation, and disempowerment increases. And these restrictive definitions of culture ignore the existence of an interplay of individuals' multiple cultural identities and how this interplay impacts a student or family's experiences with the education system. In other words, we know that all families are unique and different and diverse. And rather than lumping families who may speak one language in one category and assuming they all have the same characteristics, we need to look differently. We need to look more closely and understand that there are a lot of different components to the diversity of families. We also know that there are collaborative barriers for those families that are non-dominant or culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse. Those are inequity, unrealistic expectations that might be set by educators on the type of expectations we might have for family participation. For example, there is a great amount of literature and emphasis that identifies volunteering as an important component of parent involvement. And unfortunately, volunteering isn't something that might work well with someone who has not a very demanding job, who's unable to volunteer, who has a lot of children, different care responsibilities, or that might not be part of that family's culture. We also know that there's a lack of cultural responsiveness and a lack of understanding what cultural impacts might look like when we work with diverse families. We know there's also a lack of or inappropriate accommodations related to language, including a lack of skilled interpreters that might be available for IEP meetings, for example, despite that being federally mandated. We have multiple research studies that document families saying that they have still attended IEP meetings with interpreters that either they might be of the same culture, but speak a different dialect, and or they might not be available at all. And something has been asked where something in professional, such as the school custodian or secretary, being asked to interpret at an IEP meeting or important family professional interaction. We also know that there's often insufficient information available about the special education process for those individuals who do come from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. Deficit views of families and children. So unfortunately, biases do exist and may have implications on those families. IEPs and parent right documents, which are the one sort of consistent guiding framework we have available to families to hopefully understand the special education process. And unfortunately, research has indicated that not only are those documents written in ways that are difficult to understand and interpret it, but they're also written at a graduate education level. So those individuals who might have limited English skills and in general do not have a graduate degree are unable to interpret those effectively. And then we know that there's a noted power imbalance with school personnel. For example, at meetings, it's very common to have multiple educators with maybe one or two family members present, which can automatically create a sense of power imbalance. And then finally, there's noted areas where assessment results and maybe other paperwork has not been translated in time for IEP meetings or other important meetings so that families can effectively collaborate. So knowing those barriers exist, what are some things we can do about that? What are some strategies we can use to address? I'm going to present some frameworks that will, first of all, help us identify ways to view families and move forward from there with some specific strategies. So there's some promising frameworks for conceptualizing culture and diversity for families. These include the interrelated notions of intersectionality and discrit, and I will explain those in a moment, as well as equitable collaboration. Please note that references are always available with this presentation. And when we look at intersectionality, what we know about that is that, first of all, the understanding and theory of intersectionality is that it grew out of race, class, and gender studies movements in the 1980s. There was a concern with issues of inequality, power, and politics. Intersectionality rejects unitary conceptualizations of identity, and it allows the examination of simultaneous interactions among race, class, gender, and ability, and the interactions that exist between these multiple identities and organizational responses. It's rooted in the hierarchical nature of power. There's a belonging to a multiple discriminated groups that can mean that institutional barriers or biases can pile up as a result. So the more discrimination that we might have experienced, obviously the more institutional barriers we would experience as a result. And then several scholars are interested now as a result in disability and educational research. Several scholars in those areas have proposed intersectionality as a framework for guiding special education research and practice, knowing that using this framework allows us to be more diverse and differentiate according to each family's unique needs. Meanwhile, Discrit theorizes about the ways in which race, racism, disability, and ableism are built into the interactions, procedures, and discourses and institutions of education, which affect students of color with disabilities qualitatively different than white students with disabilities. And I encourage you to read more about this as you might want, if you want to know more about this. Finally, equitable collaboration has 4 unique components. Those include roles, goals, strategies, change processes. So the roles are the notion that successful collaborations with school personnel with school require that non-dominant families and communities are viewed as holding critical insights, expertise, and potential leadership necessary for addressing educational disparities. The goals of equitable collaboration is that there's a shift from remediation approaches that are designed to fix parents to a culture of shared responsibility. Strategies that are part of equitable collaboration are those that have relationship and capacity building for systemic change. And change processes are an approach to educational change that addresses political and social issues in the broader community. Equitable collaboration uses these 4 components, roles, goals, strategies, and change processes, to encourage family and professional collaboration that is equitable, meaningful, and can promote a trusting partnership. So now when we talk about what that means, what is a culturally responsive, trusting family professional partnership, we're going to be breaking that down a little bit further with some specific strategies in the next section. First, the definition for culturally responsive trusting family professional partnerships are characterized by an alliance in which families and professionals confidently build in each other's word, judgment, and wise actions to increase educational benefits for students and themselves. So we're going to look briefly at the Sunshine Model of Trusting Family Professional Partnerships that is promoted out of the Turnbull and Colleagues Families and Professionals textbook, available in the references. And what I'd like to point out is that within the Sunshine Model is trust, we understand, is the foundation of the Sunshine Model. And then within that trusting component, we know that when we demonstrate respect, equity, communication, advocacy, and commitment, we are essentially building foundational components of that trusting family partnership. The rays of this Sunshine Model indicate opportunities for building partnership activities, if you will. So when there are academic learning opportunities, social emotional learning opportunities, behavioral opportunities, student assessment, special meetings such as IEPs, 504s, parent-teacher conferences, etc., and student transitions of all ages and stages. So not just those who are post-secondary planning, but also when we're moving from the IFSP to the IEP, also when we're making that transition from elementary to middle school, et cetera. So during those school transitions, how can we develop that trusting partnership with families who are culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse? And then finally, school capacity enhancement opportunities. So part of respect, equity, commitment, and the Sunshine Model is first and foremost understanding culture. So understanding that culture is more than a region where someone might come from. It is more than a language that might be spoken. Culture can include race. It can include gender. It can include disability, ethnicity, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, and there are other different forms of culture. We even talk about how within a family, there might be a unique culture that is unique to that actual family unit. That might be something specific to the way they celebrate birthdays or the way that they acknowledge positive behavior. All of these different things make up the uniqueness of what we understand to be culture. Next, we need to understand and learn about our own biases. To be culturally responsive with families, it's important that we're able to self-reflect on our own cultural beliefs and experiences. So ask yourself questions like, what are your values? What are your beliefs? What kind of an upbringing did you have that may narrate what types of expectations you may or may not have for family, professional participation or involvement? Do you believe strongly in family volunteers, for example? As we talked about earlier, is your own experience with family volunteers something, for example, did you grow up in a family where it was very important that family members volunteered? And then have you developed that as sort of your own interpretation of active family involvement, or what, when a family cares, they volunteer, might be one of your own sort of beliefs. And if that is the case, that's concerning, because that is not very culturally responsive to those families who may or may not. So it's okay to have an upbringing that might have developed some of our own beliefs. It's important that we just acknowledge and understand what those beliefs are and any biases we might have developed as a result of those. So then we can identify areas of improvement for our own culturally responsive practices. That includes being aware of all of the unique areas and different areas where families may hold different views. So for example, people from different cultures may hold different views about disability, the role of educators, conflict, gender roles, education, privacy, body language, and other examples. So keeping these types of things in mind and going back to that notion that all families are unique and different, and that there's an intersectionality of uniqueness that we need to include, that means when we get to know those unique families, we want to know what might be some of their views about disability, conflict, their role as a parent, etc. So that means one really important step in being culturally responsive is to get to know each unique family. So that includes learning about the family and the culture. That includes finding out about the family members' goals for that child, academically, behaviorally, socially, emotionally, in the school, in the home, and the community. Talking with families, getting to know what they desire for their child and what their thoughts and feelings and expectations are. Also getting to know what their own expectations or thoughts about their child's disability is. How are they perceiving that? How are they interpreting that? And then share with family members that you want to get to know them. Have a sense of openness and flexibility and understanding, so that families do feel welcome and that they can come before you and can develop that trusting partnership, which requires vulnerability. There's a lot of information here, but I want to make sure that we address that there is more than one moment to the IEP meeting. So that is, I like to say the IEP meeting is a process. There's before the meeting, during the meeting, and after the meeting. This means that as an IEP, as a culturally responsive educator who's providing IEP meeting support, there are very specific things you can do before the meeting, during, and after to provide those families support, so that they can be active participants in the way that we like and the way that's intended by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So that includes before the meeting and explaining to families and parents the timeline, the expectation about IEP meetings, their rights, what is involved in the IEP meeting and process in general, and how they can participate. Then also, it's important that if an interpreter is going to be present, that you meet with them at least 30 minutes prior to the meeting, provide a glossary of relevant terms, acronyms, and discuss how often the professionals should pause for converting oral messages. And please keep in mind that when using an interpreter, it's really important that we not only pause for the interpreter to be able to convert that oral message, but we also need to pause to allow the family members to process the information that was just shared in the oral message. So we will present our information as educators, pause and allow the interpreter to interpret, and then pause and allow the family member to process what was interpreted for them to potentially share back, rather than moving really quickly into the next set of information, which really does not invite family engagement or participation in any way. And we want family active participation. So during the meeting, how can we encourage that active participation? And also demystify a bit of that IEP meeting experience. First and foremost, have IEP team members introduce themselves at the beginning and state their roles in the meeting. And I like to state not my title, but my role. So instead of saying, I'm Dr. Tracy Gershwin, I'm a board certified behavior analyst, I would say, I'm Tracy Gershwin, and I'm here to present information about your child's behavior as the behavior analyst. My credentials are available on the IEP and in different forms. I don't need to insert my title and provide any type of judgment or disempowerment for families to feel comfortable to share. It's also important to pay attention to parents' verbal and nonverbal cues. Watch those nonverbal cues. If you see a parent that seems to be confused or unengaged or somehow maybe they're distracted because of something that might be going on, maybe a phone call or a text message about work. And so pay attention, because if they're not really able to attend, we're not really doing anyone justice. We're just talking to nothing. So it's important that we have, that we're able to provide families an opportunity to engage with us and meet with us, and we're not talking to them. So we want to keep an eye on those nonverbal and verbal cues, and then explain instructional methods to families, and clearly describe how services specifically meet student needs, rather than just presenting service options without any context. I see a lot of IEP meetings where we name interventions, we name strategies, we don't talk about what it is and how that's going to meet the child's needs. Remember, the whole point of partnering with families is for the student, and we know the more meaningful we are with our partnership, the greater the outcome for our students academically, behaviorally, and socially. So the more families understand what interventions and strategies we're utilizing, the greater they're able to implement and support the student in their home and community environment. And finally, after the meeting, it's important that we inform parents what will happen after the IEP meeting, such as when they will receive a copy of the proposed IEP and what their rights are if they disagree with the IEP. It's important to provide a written meeting summary and invite parents to call, email, or meet if they have questions. I also like to provide the opportunity for future meetings. Should they have, maybe we schedule another meeting in 6 months to check on the status of how things are going. And then finally, it's important that we have the translated IEP available to parents in a timely manner. One other strategy that is really important and effective and culturally responsive is when we utilize a cultural broker. There's a lot of new literature that's out there on this and research that is up and emerging. And it's the concept of having someone from the culture, either the student, the family, or both, depending on the need, to act as an intermediary and advocate between the family and professionals. It's essentially a person who's able to be there as an intermediary, who's able to provide that cultural, linguistic, and informational support to families. That includes navigational support, how to navigate the special education system, informational support, how to understand what's being presented and how to move accordingly forward with that. And finally, social support, having another human there who has similar experiences, similar backgrounds, similar understandings, who can be there and provide that level of support. And then, of course, it's always important to connect families with resources, whatever resources you may find to be valuable and available to those family members. And so we know that when parents, educators, and students connect with one another, good things happen academically, behaviorally, socially, and emotionally. And if we can connect families with information and resources that can empower and support them with collaborating with professionals and supporting their students, the outcomes are even greater. So I encourage you to look into options that are meaningful for connecting families with resources. That might include connecting them with your local parent training information center. It might be connecting them with a local advocacy organization. It might be if there's district resources available to provide informational sessions. Connecting families with other families is highly valuable for social support, as I stated earlier, with the benefits of cultural brokers. When we connect families with other families, we provide them with information, often families that have similar backgrounds, maybe similar students with disabilities or needs, similar experiences. Families are able to find themselves having that social connection, informational connection, navigational support, and other resources that are really well documented throughout years of experience, throughout years of research, that families connecting with families are really good. So in whatever way we connect families with resources, let's do that. Culturally, linguistically, and economically diverse families are challenged with finding themselves in a very diverse system that is a very challenging system, I should say, that is daunting, overwhelming, and can be difficult for even the most educated families to navigate. And so it's really important that we're mindful of those cultural responsive strategies and that we're aware of all the unique ways that we can meet their needs. And above all, be humble and be flexible and be willing to change. And the more we learn from families, the greater we can be as educators when we work with our students. And that is the end of our module. Thank you for joining me. Goodbye.